Okay, good afternoon. Thank you, everyone, thank you for coming to our annual fall sponsored by our Center for Health. Before I introduce our fabulous speaker today, a couple of coming attractions, but even before that, please join me in thanking our Managing Director, Jennifer Ewer, who puts everything on. Never a detail forgotten, and always with incredible positive energy. So Jennifer is amazing. So we have a lot of events coming up. A talk that's coming up in about 30 seconds. This coming Monday, October 28th, the center, in conjunction with the Domestic Violence Institute, will be hosting, in partnership with the Boston City Council, a hearing on domestic violence, sexual assault, and child abuse in the city of Boston. And this will be held in 250 next door at 5:30 p.m. on Monday. So that should be a fabulous event. And then on December 2nd, in recognition of World AIDS Day, the center, along with other centers of excellence here at the Law School, the Center for Law, Innovation, and Creativity, and the Center for Public Interest Advocacy and Collaboration, and Partners in Health Engage, will be hosting a series of events throughout the day. Again, this is December 2nd, including a new panel discussion and a film viewing. So there'll be more information about all those events coming. And then if you can fast forward to the spring, on April 17th, we're having our annual spring conference. This year it is on public health litigation, possibilities, and pitfalls. And the conference will be held in celebration of our own colleague, Dick Daynard's 50-year career as an educator, advocate, public health litigator, and really public health litigation innovator. So please join us for that. And I guess this year, I also need to mention that we are recording and live streaming this lecture. Video can be found on the School of Law's Facebook page and our webpage. So now I'm thrilled to be introducing our speaker. Gregg Gonsalvess is at Yale University, where he takes on many roles, including Assistant Professor of Epidemiology in the School of Public Health, Associate Adjunct Professor of Law at the Law School. He is co-director of the Global Health Justice Partnership, co-director of Collaboration for Research Integrity and Transparency. He does academic research on the use of quantitative models for improving the response to epidemic diseases. But before turning to that work, for more than 20 years, he worked on HIV/AIDS and other global health issues with several organizations, including the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, that's ACT UP, the Treatment Action Group, the Gay Men's Health Crisis, and AIDS and Rights Alliance for South Africa. He was also a fellow at the Open Society Foundation and in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine at the Harvard Medical School in 2011 to 2012. He's a 2011 graduate of Yale College and received his PhD from Yale Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. He is a 2000 MacArthur Fellowship, so a certified genius. I'm sure he hates when people say that. I have had the pleasure of knowing Gregg for several years now and doing some work with him, and we're inspiring, so I'm sure you will inspire us today. Please join me in welcoming Gregg.
Hey, everybody. So this is not an academic talk. It's a little bit of guided tours in my brain over the past 30 to 40 years about where I see us going in the sort of area of the intersection of health and social justice. First of all, I want to thank Jennifer and Wendy and Leo and Aziza and Claudia and everybody from the Northeastern School of Law Health Program for inviting me. As I said to Wendy, anybody who's in this public health school who wants to go to law school to study health, I tell them to come here, and then we hire graduates like Kim to work with us, because I can't think of a better group of people studying health law across the United States, so you're in good hands here. So I'm at a school of public health. If any of you went to public health school, you'd have seen these diagrams about the social determinants of health, in which whether we get sick or we get well isn't just determined about our own lives and our own constitution and our exposure to disease, but a whole range of social determinants of health, going all the way up to the socioeconomic, political, and environmental conditions we live in every day. So as somebody who's an AIDS activist and worked for many years getting antiretroviral therapy to people, I realized that health is not just about those pills into those bodies, right? It's not a new idea. The idea of social determinants of health really came about in the 19th century with the condition of the working class in England by Friedrich Engels, a report on the typhus epidemic by Rudolf Virchow, who's the father of social medicine. The bottom line is that people live in working conditions that make them sick. There's a quote from Rudolf Virchow that I wanted to read to you quickly because I think it sums up how I think about the epidemiology I do in the 21st century, and that's medical statistics will be our standard of measurement. We will weigh life and see where the dead lie thicker among the workers of the privileged. That was written in 1848. We're going to talk about how that sort of operates years later. Again, social determinants of health are a large field of inquiry. It shows up in sociology, like Eric Kleinenberg's book several years ago on the giant heat wave in Chicago, which had a differential impact on mortality among Latino and African Americans. Your local Paul Farmer's book on pathologies of power and his investigation of epidemics across the world. A book called The Plague on Your Houses by Rod and Deborah Wallace at Columbia that talked about fire policy in New York City in the 70s and how it laid the groundwork for the explosion of the AIDS and TB epidemics several years later. So there's a lot of sort of literature on the social determinants of health and how they sort of determine whether we get sick, get well, live, or die. But what's important to say is that determinants are not destiny. This is a picture of Paul Farmer's patients in Haiti, Joseph Jeune. And this is before he had access to antiretroviral therapy, and this is afterwards. So we're not, it's not fate, it's not a given that the social determinants of health drag us in one way or the other without our ability to change that history. Now, I want to talk to you about the AIDS epidemic, and there's some people in this room, like Jim McGuire and others, who were there from the beginning and have a sense of what that meant. And that's how I grew up, right? I grew up in the 80s and the 90s. That was my coming of age. That was my college years, well, my dropout of college years. And it's going to inform the way I talk about health and social justice for the rest of the talk. There's a play called Angels in America, which was on Broadway. Then it was then it was an HBO movie, and then there was another Broadway production. But it's an interesting play that's not just about the epidemic itself. It's about who we are as Americans, who we are as citizens of the world. What's interesting to me is at the end of the play, they're standing around the Bethesda fountain in New York City, and the Bethesda fountain, the myth of Bethesda, the angel Bethesda, is where she put her foot down in the temple in Jerusalem. Waters came up, anybody who walked through them were bathed and then would be healed. And so they're gathered around the Bethesda fountain at the end of the play, and the main character says, this disease will be the end of many of us, but not nearly all, and the dead will be commemorated, and we will struggle on with the living. We're not going away. We won't die secret deaths anymore. The world only spins forward. We will be citizens. The time has come. And we will be citizens. I want you to think about that in a broader sense, not in the sort of technical legal sense of who gets rights to vote and who gets border walls built to keep them in or out. Think about citizenship in this sort of meaning about belonging and who matters in the world we live in. But before we talk about HIV, I think we need to go back into ancient history a little bit. I was born in 1963. A month later, President Kennedy was assassinated, but it was in many ways sort of the last golden age of progressivism in the United States. Medicare and Medicaid, Head Start, the Job Corps, the Clean Water and Clean Air Acts, Highway Safety Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, all of these things came about under sort of the rubric of the Civil Rights Movement and the Great Society programs. It was the last sort of big gasp of classic liberal American politics, which we actually haven't seen since. Now, the 60s were all about peace, love, and understanding. And it was a time of violence and war, great social unrest, and great cultural changes. And I think this is how my parents experienced it. In a suburb of New York, they had left New York City to sort of get out of the sort of chaos of urban life and wanted a peaceful life in the suburbs where they wouldn't be bothered. But then the 60s exploded with the Vietnam War, with protests, with riots. Here are some of the pictures that were in the newspapers and on TV networks during that day. And this is how I think my parents saw what happened in the 60s. They were raising a family out on Long Island, New York. And there was a guy who just had to trade on people's fears and resentments to gain political power. It may start to feel like a familiar story, but it's not who you think. Richard Nixon. And Rick Perlstein's book called Nixonland talks about how we live in Nixonland today. And he wrote this a while ago. And he talks about how the whole sort of backlash to the 1960s set up a politics that we basically live in today, my generation and your generation today. And Tony Judd, who's a historian who died of ALS several years ago, wrote a book to actually young people, wrote it to his kids' generation about this transformation of Western society. And he said, there's something profoundly wrong with the way we live today. For 30 years, you've made a virtue out of self-interest, and this very pursuit of material self-interest now constitutes what remains of our sense of collective purpose. We don't ask things like, is it good or is it fair, is it just, is it right? And he says at the end of this book, shortly before his death, we need to learn to pose these questions again. So think of this. You've got a wave of progressivism in the 60s, you have this backlash in the 70s, you have this sort of rise of the sort of Reagan-Thatcher era in the 80s, and then a new epidemic, right? So from this liberalism of the 60s, you have this epidemic come into the United States, arise around the world. This is this sort of era of far less generous social and economic life is happening in the United States. For people who were around during that time, pictures like this are iconic pictures. They almost look like Renaissance paintings, but were very real for those of us who were taking care of the people we loved and cared for. For me, it was very personal. This is my cousin Carl, who died in 1995. This is my friend Jay Funk in the bus shelter there in the East Village, who died several months later. It was a catastrophe. Right? It's hard to explain it to people who didn't live through it. There's an activist named Vito Russo, who was a film historian. But because it was life during wartime, he put aside a lot of his work and became a leader in ACT UP. And Vito, at a demonstration at HHS in DC, said, living with AIDS is like living through a war in which it's happening for only those people who happen to be in the trenches. Every time a shell explodes, you look around and you discover that you've lost more of your friends and nobody else notices. Only you can hear the screams of people who are dying and the cries for help. Nobody seems to be noticing. Right? And then a new group arises to fight for the rights of people living with HIV. This is many groups arose, but my education and my involvement in the early days of the AIDS epidemic was really filtered through a group called the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. I'm going to talk about how this changes the shape of how we deal with health and social justice in the United States and beyond. And what's important to realize is that we can see health as a political issue, and that there were not only social determinants of health, but political determinants. I teach a course at Yale called Political Epidemiology, and a lot of that is based on what I learned outside of the halls of academia on the streets of New York and other places, but how I think the world works and which is the story I'm telling today. And this is some of the iconography of ACT UP from groups like Grand Fury and the Silence Equals Death Project. can tell we had a very specific idea of cause and effect. Ed Kocher is the mayor of New York City, who loved to say, "How am I doing?" Well, how are you doing? 10,000 New York City AIDS deaths. Cardinal O'Connor was the cardinal of the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of New York. Condoms, not as a cardinal. He was a public health menace to those of us in active. These showed up on buses across New York City and other places. And some of it may seem, quaint to you now in terms of expressions of sexuality that people take for granted. But not as an aside, maybe a little bit of an aside, that gay marriage wouldn't be here unless some of the visibility that AIDS thrust on LGBT life in America hadn't happened. President after president but I think this sort of sums it up in terms of how we thought about what was happening back then, and a little bit about how I think about things now, that the government continues to ignore the lives, deaths, and suffering of people with HIV because they're gay, Black, Hispanic, or poor. By Independence Day, 1989, over 50,000 people were killed. Remember, this is an epidemic that started less than a decade before this. So, don't have time to tell you the whole tale, but I think we revolutionized how we think about drug development for HIV, but also more generally for life-threatening diseases. We opened up access to experimental drugs and sped up FDA approval in a way that people didn't think possible. In fact, the pharmaceutical industry didn't think possible because they hated the FDA and its new powers given under the Favre amendments around the time I was born to ensure the efficacy and safety of drugs. But ACT UP opened up approval time at the FDA, shortening approval time by years. We looked at gaps and redundancies in the AIDS research program. I remember sitting in my old boyfriend's apartment, and in the heat of a summer, I think it was '92, and we're going through all the NIH's AIDS grants. And this is before the internet, so these are like the printouts where you have to pull the little perforated tab at the side. And we had hundreds of boxes of paper around the room, and sort of tried to think about where were we missing things in the fight for AIDS in the context of research? Where was there lots of duplication? Where was there poor management? We ended up putting out a report that ended up getting attention of the Clinton administration and ended up being passed through Congress to reorganize AIDS research based on the assessment of a college dropout and a film studies major from Harvard down the road. But this was happening all over the country. People were without expertise or without the degrees, were going into these systems and revolutionizing what was happening based on needing to teach themselves what was going on because it was a matter of life and death for them. This is a picture of aerosolized pentamidine, a drug to treat pneumonia that people with AIDS get. NIH, National Institutes of Health, wasn't interested in doing it, so the Community Research Initiative, community docs and community activists put together trials to test this drug. So we were doing what the government should have done on our own with people in our community who cared and had the expertise to do so. And if they didn't have it, we did it ourselves. It wasn't just in research and development for drugs. We invented safer sex. My old doctor, Joe Sonnabend, wrote a pamphlet with Richard Berkowitz, who's a sex worker and patient of his, called How to Have Sex in an Epidemic, One Approach. This is before HIV was known as the cause of AIDS, and they just put two and two together that this seemed to be operating like a sexually transmitted disease. Needle exchange, my current hometown of New Haven, Connecticut, and other places around the U.S. With people with AIDS and who inject drugs, invented needle exchanges in HIV transmission, HIV prevention intervention. And we worked with lawyers and legal scholars to help protect people against discrimination. I was talking to a friend of mine 2 days ago about his early work at Lambda Legal Defense Fund when the HIV test was being used. And Lambda came out against it because there were no protections to deal with discrimination in housing and employment. And what happened after the test got licensed? Hundreds and hundreds of cases of discrimination came in to lend a legal defense for people who were being fired or thrown out of their apartments because they were HIV positive. But none of it came easily. It wasn't just sort of nice art and agitprop and sort of technical engagement with the NIH or the FDA. We fought hard to get what we needed. These are demonstrations at the National Institute of Health and at the FDA. The NIH now has, in Bethesda, we call it campus, very nice to walk around, but now it's surrounded by giant fence. It wasn't us, it was 9/11, which gave us the sort of high security stakes at NIH, but nobody brought thousands of people to the lawn of Building 1 at NIH before ACT UP did it in the early 90s. And basically, we forced our way to have a seat at the table among scientists and doctors who were designing drug trials, who were conducting clinical research, not just by the force of the ideas that we had in our treatment agendas for every international AIDS conference, but because they were scared to death of us and the thousands of people we could put on their doorstep at any given moment. The same thing for FDA changes, drug approval. Yes, we said there was a reason that you should streamline drug approval, but we also were, my friend Peter Staley, who was up on the awning of the FDA building in Rockville with a Silence Equals Death banner. If you watch the movie How to Survive a Plague, you can see like people looking down from their offices in Rockville at Peter being dragged away shortly after the banner went up. What's interesting is that sometimes social movements have their own sort of peculiar domestic context which lets them grow and flourish. But AIDS activism is now global. Just a friend of mine from South Africa just left to go back home a couple of weeks ago. And I met her when I lived and worked in South Africa. But it's interesting. This is a quote from Johnny Steinberg, a journalist who wrote a book called 3 Letter Plague about HIV in the Eastern Cape, South Africa. But he says something about the social movement around AIDS, which is really interesting. And think about that question of citizenship that I posed to you a few minutes ago. The idea of demanding that a drug be put on a shelf or that a doctor arrive at a point in time is without precedent. The social movement to which AIDS medicine has given birth is utterly novel in this part of the world. The relationships between its members and state institutions previously unheard of. The state, the members of the populous citizenry and the state, relationship exchange has been unheard of. It happened in New York, it happened in LA, it happened in Bethesda, it happened in South Africa. And these are pictures of marches by the Treatment Action Campaign, which was very active in the 2000s, trying to fight for access to antiretroviral therapy, which now is on the market all around the world, except they couldn't get it because their president thought HIV was not AIDS, and that antiretroviral therapy was poison. And a lot of people like to say, the apartheid movement, civil rights movement, there's all these histories of vibrant social struggle, both in South Africa and the US. This is not something that's sort of exportable to other places around the world. Or Russia, Ukraine, and other Soviet states have had their AIDS activist movements as well. These are people with ICCERU and Front AIDS demonstrating in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. This is a picture of with the cops with the bolt cutters. People who inject drugs tie themselves to the health ministry offices in Kaliningrad just to protest the treatment of people living with AIDS and people who inject drugs. I think this was around 2000 or 2001. But it was the time of the internet then, and they could send out an alert to everybody around the world, and thousands of faxes came into the police precinct offices, and they were released several hours later. But they are doing heroic work in horrible circumstances right now. So it's not just in the context of sort of vibrant democracies with histories of social justice, vibrant folks. It's also not just about HIV anymore. This is the same group, the Treatment Action Campaign, talking about transforming TB prevention and diagnosis, which is the leading killer of people living with HIV. There's a court case in Uganda, a constitutional challenge against unnecessary maternal deaths. I think this says 16 pregnant women die daily in Uganda. These are activists from the Delhi network of people living with AIDS, but they're arguing for treatment for hepatitis C. I know this is going to look terrible because it never renders well, but in any case, Gilead Pharmaceuticals makes a drug that can cure hepatitis C 8 to 12 weeks. It came out on the market at $8,000 a pill. Why? Because that's what the market could bear. Like people in India, Egypt, all around the world are saying we need access to these drugs, and that's not a price. We did a paper a few years ago looking at access to hepatitis C drugs in state prisons, in jails in the U.S. 1% of inmates with hepatitis C get access to these drugs, mostly because it's the price, even if it was half of this, is not affordable for state institutions that work on fixed appropriations from year to year. Wendy and I were talking about our Ebola case. We sued the state of Connecticut around the Ebola quarantine several years ago, and it's now somewhere lost in the Second Circuit. Like 2 years, who knows? But when the Ebola epidemic exploded in West Africa, there was a huge backlash in the Northeast about possibility of infection, which is erroneous and sort of not more to any evidence. Governor Malloy, Democrat, Governor Cuomo, Democrat, Governor Christie, Republican, so bipartisan sort of madness about Ebola, and about needing to quarantine healthcare workers when they came back. I was in the PhD program at Yale then. One of my colleagues, PhD student, was locked up. Actually, 2 PhD students at Yale were locked up because they'd come back from Liberia. A West African family in West Haven down the road from us was also locked up. But the people who rose up to speak out against the quarantines, again, were the people who had seen this 20 years before. The fear, loathing, and paranoia around HIV was now coming back to suggest that Ebola was a crime and Ebola transmission was a crime, and we needed to lock up these disease people. So this is a demonstration outside of Bellevue Hospital in New York. This is a poster by ACT UP New York talking about Ebola not being a crime. But again, these social movements have follow-on impacts around the world, but also back in our own home country on other diseases and other areas of social life. These are some of the reports we do as part of the Global Health Justice Program at Yale, but a lot of it is based on the idea that partner with local groups that are interested in addressing a given issue that has a connection between public health, clinical medicine, social justice. And so we did one on fear politics and Ebola, which Wendy reviewed and was helpful in the court case that came out of that. We worked on silicosis among gold miners in Southern Africa, working with human rights groups there. On the cholera epidemic in Haiti and the UN's culpability for this. We worked with a group called Black Mamas Matter in Georgia on maternal mortality and racial disparities in Georgia. This is all sort of modeled not on sort of an academic way of working, but in a way we work as an action group and ACT UP in terms of using community activists and people with expertise to sort of outline a policy agenda for change. We just happen to be doing in the context of a law school and a public health. So our work in AIDS is not over. I do not believe these figures, but I will say them anyway. So WHO says 23.3 million people now get access to antiretroviral therapy, about 60% of the people, which still leaves you with 40% of people who still need access to antiretroviral therapy. These are people who probably had access at one point to these drugs. Doesn't mean they're on them now. We're still in a situation where there's a large gap between who has and who doesn't have in terms of the drugs that I take every morning. But there's been a terrible backlash, and it's not just over the past. As all this sort of AIDS activism erupted in South Africa, in India, in Russia, all over the world in the 2000s, there was a counter movement. And it started around 2008, around the economic crisis. But it was saying that, you know what? All this sort of focus on HIV and malaria and TB is really distracting us from other much more important things. We need to put a plague in perspective. How do you put a plague in perspective? It's like, Bill Easterly, who's a famous development economist, was saying, This was all, the whole fight against AIDS was manufactured by Gates, Bono, and Clinton, right? And that he sort of erases the role of social movements in this struggle. And all of this is happening all around the same time, basically saying, whoa, we're too much on HIV. We need to back off and think of other ways of fighting and addressing global health. And then and even now, I think, pretends to be have larger health concerns. Let's have universal health care or these larger approaches to health. But, the Alma-Ata Declaration, half a century ago, said health for all. And it was not a successful initiative. And we made so many strides in HIV and TB and malaria that I think there was something else going on among these sort of decision makers. And I think it was about the fact that they wanted to quiet down demanding patients, about doing the least amount for the least amount of people with the least amount of money. This is austerity economics coming out of the global financial crisis. It was the collapse of the Greek public health system and the explosion of HIV, the attacks on the National Health Service in Great Britain. This is a sort of Malthusian return into American politics that basically said we can't afford to provide health care for everybody who needs it. And we've got to sort of be happy to fight for the crumbs from the table. No. We fought back. This is a demonstration at the International AIDS Conference on the top. The bottom one is my favorite time as an undergraduate because, I was a very old undergraduate, very old. I was in my 40s, and the rest of them were 18. Right? But a bunch of us from up and down the sort of Boston to New York corridor, Barack Obama was coming to Bridgeport, Connecticut, New Haven, and he'd been saying, when I become president, I'm going to put $50 billion for AIDS on the table. Well, he didn't. And so we stuffed banners down our pants and walked into this rally of 6,000, 7,000 people in Bridgeport. And when the president got up to speak, first group came up with a banner saying $50 million for AIDS, broken promises kill. President Obama's face just sort of hits. And we got dragged out and spit upon, and all this stuff was terrible. 10 minutes later, the second group of us gets up. And now he's really, really pissed. What's interesting is David Carroll, who's right here, his parents were just livid that he had done this. He's now working somewhere in the Eastern Cape, South Africa, and ended up on the front page of the New York Times because Joe Gay Stolbrook, who's a reporter, said, wait, these young people and then this old guy. Oh, that old guy I know from ACT UP. What was going on? And the story is that these movements are not linked just across countries and across issues. They're linked across generations. David Carroll and the people who did the Student Global AIDS campaign groups in Boston and New York, in San Francisco and other places really are a new generation of AIDS activists who were following the footsteps of people 30 years before they even knew about the disease and what was going on. A little bit more. I was reading this book by two guys from Boston, Ernest Moglu and James Robinson, MIT and Harvard, about global development economics and why nations fail, why do democracies and economies flourish. And I was reading it, and it came across this passage which freaked me out. It basically said, those who have power make choices that create poverty. They get it wrong not by mistake or ignorance, but on purpose. I just crossed out poverty and pain, build health. And you don't need to be a PhD in economics to realize what they're saying. It's that they're political determinants of health, and that the picture of Ronald Reagan that says he kills me, they're saying in more academic jargon that there are decisions made that are purposeful and planned, which dictate whether we live or die, whether we live or die in poverty or wealth. Not to be Debbie Downer, but bigger threats have emerged, right? There's a political scientist named Corey Robin at Brooklyn College, New York, and he wrote a piece, Jacob and the Democratic Socialist website, talking about the rise of a counter-majoritarian party committed to minoritarian rule to the court, Senate, and electoral college. Welcome to today in the United States. And he talks about how we are under threat. In a way that is unprecedented for many of us who thought the AIDS epidemic was the worst thing we'd ever lived through. It's it's a scary moment in American history. But what's interesting to me is that our struggles have roots in our history, buried in our geography, right? They play out across real bodies, whether they're people living with AIDS, women dying in childbirth in Uganda, people who use drugs dying of overdose in West Virginia or St. Petersburg, and old battles are springing up in new forms. This is a picture of the density of slaves in the American South around the time of the Civil War. Look at this sort of high concentration of slaves in sort of what's called the Black Belt in the South. This is a map of life expectancy by county in the USA. The density of slaves comes from war 150 years or more later is also has a signal that talks about what life expectancy is there. Life expectancy is lesser in sort of the Black Belt of the United States and other places, country. And yes, correlation is not causation, but it's a pretty strong signal for an epidemiologist to say something's going on. I always, and I don't mean to just pick on the American South. This is Hartford in Connecticut, halfway between Boston and New York, in case you haven't been there. But there were racial covenants about where people could live in the city as late as the middle of the 20th century. And when you fast forward to the current time, you see a divide, a gradient in life expectancy. And this is your own senator talking about the entire legal structures that were created to prevent African Americans from building economic security through home ownership, also consign them to be sicker, shorter lives than white counterparts. I live in one of the most unequal states in the country. I'm not going to take you through all the details, but asthma, diabetes, infant mortality, whether you're African American or Latino in the state of Connecticut, is going to really determine your risk of asthma, diabetes, or infant mortality. A map of police violence in the United States. Just the number of incidents alone should send you asking. I think you may know Janelle Monáe. So there's a song that I think this is an epidemiological investigation. He's saying those dots you see blinking on that map, they have character and an identity, and it's largely African Americans who are disproportionately affected by police violence. And if you don't know the song, you should listen to it on YouTube. It's amazing because in epidemiology we count because what counts matters, and she's doing the same thing through song. I know you've seen the 1619 issue of the New York Times. If you haven't seen it, Delene Ingerlandi, who's also their op-ed page editor, one of them, on health, wrote a piece about why we don't have national health insurance in the U.S. and she traces sort of the history of American racism and slavery to the roots of sort of the debates we're having about Medicare for all and the ACA nowadays. Interesting too, this map about supportive policies on women and children's health. Remember, we're talking about gradients based on race and life expectancy, but you can see these gradients in terms of infant mortality. The states in the South have disproportionate sort of infant mortality compared to the rest of their peers, and it correlates with policies that are meant to promote women and children's health that you find they don't promote women and children's health, and then the body count is in infant mortality in these same states. All building a story that's sort of hard to avoid. Look at the density of HIV prevalence among non-Medicaid and expansion states. Again, we see these states that have made particular political decisions, policies enacted not by accident but by choice, which have created the current HIV epidemic in the United States. I spent the last part of my PhD looking at the Scott County outbreak of HIV in Indiana. And as I was telling somebody yesterday, having to go through the newspaper. I went through the data, but also went through the newspaper reports and talking to the physician, one family physician on the ground who dealt with a lot of the people who were converted. It was devastating, right? We know how to prevent HIV transmission, right? Go to the pictures of needle exchange being pioneered in New York City and New Haven and other places around the world at the beginning of the epidemic, but it seems like we don't have all the tools we need. Some of those tools are social and economic. And, the sad thing is that we still are caught by surprise. Lawrence and Lowell just had an outbreak several years ago, which is ongoing, of HIV. They've had them in Seattle, in several counties in West Virginia, in Cincinnati, in Northern Kentucky, and in Miami. We know it works from a biomedical perspective, but do we know it works politically? Apparently not. So, almost done. I introduced you to Vito Russo earlier, and he gave a talk in Albany, New York, the state capital of New York, in 1988. And he gave another speech, and he said, we're so busy putting out fires right now. Everybody wakes up and reads the news and takes. I live in a complete mode of panic and dread every time I wake up. But he says, if we don't have the time to talk to each other and strategize and plan for the next wave and the next day and the next month, we're going to have to find time to do that, right? Someday this will be over. Sometime we'll be able to sort of say that we lived through this era as well. But once we do that, we have to basically kick the shit out of this disease, whether it's HIV or breast cancer or early maternal death. We need to kick the shit out of the system so this never happens again, is what Vito said. And you may think it's a nice sort of throwback to the early days of ACT UP, but TikTok, time's up. Okay? We can make new posters that say "He kills me," and there'd be another president's face on that grand jury poster. We have the opportunity to do something in DC, beginning of November. I think it's totally tied to whether we get sick or whether we die, together or alone. Back to Virchow, medical statistics will be our standard of measurement. We'll weigh life and see where the dead life live among the workers of privilege. I think for 200 years we know what the answer to that is. Poor die younger, rich die older ages. Social and economic and political determinants of health really drive survival in this new century. And so, if you want to find me, there's the right brain part of me that does mathematical modeling, which is the public health modeling unit. And then there's the political policy side of me, which is with the Global Health Justice Partnership. But you can basically find me by this email and this phone number, or these. I'm glad to take. Question?
No, I just want
So you talked a little bit about how the FDA had a big role. I'm wondering what the FDA's role in this is like today.
So this is a long story, but so the FDA, the modern FDA was born out of tragedy, in the beginning of the 20th century. Vaccines, contaminated elixirs. There's a lot of sort of snake oil out on the market. And over time, the FDA's powers were sort of enlarged in the 20th century. And one of the big changes was the Harris government in 1960-something, 62 or 63, which said drugs not only have to be safe, but they have to be effective. And drug companies were like, no, don't make us do this. And they put a program together in which they sort of looked back at all the drugs that were on the market to see if they were safe or effective. And a bunch of them, thousands of them, came off the market. Drug companies said this was going to destroy drug development as we knew it. We'd never, ever, ever see a cure for any human disease again in our lifetime. And of course, there's a huge renaissance in biomedical research, which is not just about regulatory structures, but about the molecular revolution and other things. So from 63 through the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, pharma is just going, oh my God, get the FDA off our backs. We need to make things faster. And then ACT UP came on board and said, the FDA is killing us. They're like, oh my God, that's the slogan, right? And this is the rise of Reagan. This is the rise of the regulatory sort of push among the new Republican Party. And we streamlined drug approval processes. You made it easier to get drugs if you wanted to get early access to experimental therapies. And then we realized, ooh, you know what? It's not just about speeding access to the FDA. You know, we need to know we need the drugs in our hands. We need pills into bodies, as I said at the beginning, but you also need to know that they work. And by 93, 94, we're like, you know, there's got to be a balance here, but it's too late. The cat was out of the bag. Pharma has now spent 30 years sort of repeating the line of the FDA is killing us with new patient groups. 85% of patient groups around the U.S. for any disease are funded by pharma. There's a new bill called the 21st Century Cures Act, which sort of kept, you know, there have been several bills. The latest one was the 21st Century Cures Act. Elizabeth Warren was the only two senators who voted against it, which basically put into place other sort of deregulatory policies at the FDA, and nobody opposed it. Like, you know, American Cancer Society, everybody was behind it. But, you know, the collaboration for research integrity and transparency, which sort of closed shop last summer, one of the work we did was to look at the sort of standards of evidence at the FDA, and they are getting worse and worse and worse. We're paying more and more for the drugs we have now, and know less and less about them. So the situation is pretty dire. The FDA is under siege, and you know, we just keep hoping that it's not going to be a horrible FDA commissioner every time a new one is appointed. But we're in sort of the grips of the deregulatory movement that wants to get rid of the EPA, the FDA, and everything else, and some of that's our fault around the FDA. Other comments? Yeah.
Thinking about application. So I don't know how involved you are in the drug pricing control strategies. If I was to reflect back on sort of this, I think it's where you're going, sort of a complicated part that history, it was about how our language, our litigation facilitated pharma's interests. And a lot of other groups wanted to have consumer groups that were like AIDS, Alzheimer's. Pharma created consumer groups.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about sort of how you think consumer voices, as they're organized? I know you distinguish ACT UP from it, but how consumer voices and interests get compromised by the role pharma playing in paying for facilitating their work?
So last month I was in Indianapolis, the home of Eli Lilly, which makes insulin for diabetes. And there's a group they call T1 International, who do not take drug company money. And it was heartrending because that night we went in front of Eli Lilly and a mother got up who had lost her son 4 weeks ago for diabetic ketoacidosis, right? A young woman gets up who lost her sister 6 months ago because she was rationing her insulin. A woman who lost her son a year ago, she came in to see him dead on the floor. He'd been dead for 2 days because he was cutting his insulin doses and died of diabetes. The price of insulin, which was never patented by its Canadian inventors, the price of it has gone up exponentially over the past few years. It's unaffordable for many people. And it's interesting that the American Diabetes Association and some of these larger, the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, will talk about the need for access, but they'll never talk about the cartel behavior of Sanofi, Lilly, and the other one. The other company makes, they act like a cartel. Their prices go up in lockstep, and maybe they're not liable for legal action based on their monopolistic behavior, but their prices go up in lockstep, and they go up and up and up. And lots of patient groups won't touch it, except a small group of scrappy activists who have had enough. and see an affinity with the old days of ACT UP and that work. But it's really hard. Like, we had lots of fights around the 21st Century Cures Act because, groups who were allies on NIH funding were like, oh, FDA, demonizing FDA is a high priority for industry and their donors. And even on drug pricing, like Gilead, which makes the HCV drug, they have a big share of the market for HIV, including drugs for pre-exposure prophylaxis. They actually don't own the patent of pre-exposure prophylaxis for PrEP on their drugs. And a group of activists sort of found this out and said, the CDC needs to invoke its patent rights and take it back from Gilead and make it affordable for people around the world and around the country. A lot of AIDS groups, big AIDS groups, didn't want to touch it. And when you look at their list of donors, right at the top, the biggest donor of them all is Gilead. And so, there's a lot of sort of co-optation and conflict of interest now that makes it hard to do sort of drug policy stuff, drug pricing stuff in the context of patient advocacy. And so you see coming out of other sort of groups, smaller groups, or coming out of people who have sort of other interests that are not sort of tightly prescribed by their donors' needs and wishes.
I used the voice to start, but I was wondering if you could say something about just on the last point you made about the press shop, the New York Times about how women were. And I wrote an op-ed this that's sort of circular. To the drug trials that were in progress and added women into the trials. I was just wondering. I was just looking at your response to that. What your take is on this current environment that seems to be replicating problems of the past with inclusion. And then I have another question. If that's related to us. How you think about where we should, how and where we should probably, because I'm working on the women's rights groups that were active in. And thinking a little bit about how public health as a field should take into the role of social movement. Like social movement stories often told as a separate story, and then we get to the FDA, and then you kind of have to do all the extra work that you've done today. This is an amazing talk. So remind everybody that this wasn't due to science and expertise, it was due to our political struggle. Changes that we started.
So one is they shouldn't have approved Descovy for PrEP based on the trial, from the trials to begin with. I mean, it's also nobody needs Descovy. PDF is actually fine for PrEP. There's not a big differential in the safety profile of the drug, even though Gilead is sort of plastered the world with the idea that you must go to TAP and leave TDF. So it's abominable what happened, and they had a choice there to sort of say, we're not going to approve it for half the world,
right?
Especially when there's no sort of imminent medical need. The social movement stuff, I remember the Global Health Justice Partnership. We was a class I teach with my friends Amy and Ali. It was so hard listening. But I remember a public health student coming up to me and saying, I'd love to take the course, but I'm not so into the politics and all this. I'm like, what? It's like you go to public health school to become a technical expert, right? You go to law school to become a technical expert. You learn the law, or you learn epidemiology or biostatistics, and politics is messy, and you say things that get people mad. You may say things that make your neighbors mad, and I think it's very hard to talk about the politics of health, even in a public health school. It does get done, but it's clearly there's an urge to professionalize, to make things technical. Also, none of us are incentivized to do work on social movement. The NIH is not going to fund work on social movement, so the work becomes off to the side of everything else that's happening. In places on hard money, you see some of it in sociology departments and in sort of hard money places and universities that can do that work, but it's really hard to do. So yeah, I mean, and I think, ACT UP's links with the civil rights movement, but also the women's health movement. There's tons of stuff that where you can make a case for social movements as sort of a key political determinant of health for the better.
I really found reservation with the thought of putting out fires right now with a lot of different overall issues, and I was just wondering, have any advice for students who are just now?
We should figure it all out together. but it's. I think what Vito is like. You could be at a demonstration every day. You could be writing a letter to the editor every day, and you probably should be, because for every one person who says I'm going to wake up and get out of bed and not just bury my head in my hands, there are people, but you also can't burn out. It's the point is like all this has been happening for centuries in the U.S. It means you have to figure out this sort of life balance where you're able to sort of committed to sort of the present struggles, but figure out what's going to happen, what the long game is. The weird thing is that I was born in '63. When did Goldwater run for president? Before, when Goldwater lost, the American right sort of reorganized, and they had a long game. Trump is the end of a process, not an aberration. It's the beginning of there's a long arc of sort of the rise of the religious right and the deregulatory movement over time. We don't have a long game in the progressive movement. I don't feel like we have this sort of arc where we think we're going to be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now. And that's what Vito is talking about. It's we can deal with this bill or that bill or this policy or that policy, but where do we want to be 20 years from now? And I just don't feel like we're there in terms of that kind of sort of discipline and organization on the progressive side of politics. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's hidden mass.
About how we found policy-oriented solutions. And I was wondering if you've seen any promise and any, but then kind of tangentially related to that, even if you have a political leader who's willing to take action, it seems passed. So I was just wondering if you've seen.
So I'm totally hopeful. But the demonstrated against Obama several years ago. That I did now is ha ha ha, you fools, right? But the point is, it's even when your friends are in power, you still have to keep their feet to the fire. And the idea that there's a time where you can sort of pull back the chair, put up your feet, and say my job is done, just creates more of a mess. I mean, what's interesting to me is in 1996, all these new age drugs came online. I would be dead if they didn't. But a lot of people who had access to health insurance, who had relative comfort in their lives, just took their marbles and went home from the AIDS movement. And now you see this exploding epidemic, continues to explode in African American communities in the rural South among MSM, because everybody thought their job was done. So the point is, yeah, there's hope. We'll get rid of them in November, or we'll get rid of them whenever. But it doesn't matter. You're always going to be forced to sort of keep your foot on the pedal and moving forward, because we're under. I talked about the role of pharma. And there's enormous amounts of wealth arrayed against disenfranchised. That's why we're disenfranchised. And so there's not going to be a lot of sleeping in the next few decades ahead. But there is hope. I think, I thought I'd be dead. I think a lot of people thought they'd be dead by now in terms of the AIDS movement. I think lots of other things that happen in the world where we've made significant progress on lots of health indicators, but no rest, basically. That's it.
You touched on a few examples, but I'm curious in what the role was of lawyers and the justice system to help push it forward.
So lawyers were really important. I I don't know what it, I didn't go to law school, so I don't know what it is about law school, but a lot of the actors I work with were lawyers, but they weren't doing law. There's something the way they make you think and write here in law schools that gives, like a lot of the drug development stuff. Jay Lipner, David Barr, I can list like 5 or 6 people who did all this amazing drug development work, which had nothing to do with their legal training per se. So I think like, there were legal academics who helped. There were people who were in positions of power, like Tim Westmoreland, who worked for Henry Waxman for a long time, and others who did amazing work and writing legislation. But lawyers have a big role in the movement. South Africa that I was talking about, the Truth in Action campaign was this huge mass movement. But there's another movement on the side of it called the Aids Law Project, where there was all these public interest lawyers who were suing the Western Cape Health Department, or suing the South African government, or suing the pharmaceutical company. Edwin Cameron, who had just retired from the Supreme Court's Constitutional Court in South Africa, came out as an HIV positive gay man when he was in one of the highest sort of judicial posts in the land. And so lawyers are really, really important. The one thing I would say is that they're secondary actors. If you don't have the mass movement, if you don't have the social movements, it's not enough. But lawyers have been integral parts. They become these supporting connective tissue and catalysts in the movement. And so, they're overrepresented, I think. I mean, in a good way. In lots of social movements. Think of all the social movements past and the people at legal training.
I think in the past few years, like 20 years,
well, part of me hates I clicked on Instagram or Facebook and did my civic duty today. But then did you see the climate march in New York City? Who organized that? I don't know who organized that. I think it was this weird ability of social media to sort of get the word out and created this it wasn't completely spontaneous, but social media can be a catalyst for organizing. I think it has the bad side where it gives people the idea that they can sort of debate online, and that's what they need to do. I do think Timothy Snyder from Yale has the 20 things about tyranny. I can't remember what the title of the book is, but one of them is Howard wants you to get soft in your chair. I want you to sort of sit back, relax, and you have to get out and you have to be with people. And as social media is able to do that and sort of get you out on the street to know that the demonstration's happening, on Beacon Hill or in Washington D.C., that's great. If it sort of isolates you into sort of online flame wars with people at home, that seems to be. Other questions?
You may not. But the Congress considering drug pricing here right now, but it's laying a base. There's things that have been talked about forever, but the HHS secretary, or let's use international benchmark.
Yeah.
And groups are divided. They're really divided. That's my question. Isn't about the questions on thoughts about what it means to move to national formularies, benchmark prices, negotiated.
So I will tend to be on the sort of, this bill just came out in Texas, Lloyd Doggett bill in DC, which has encapsulates a lot of the sort of work we've been thinking about. He calls it not compulsory licensing, he calls it, I can't remember what he calls it, but there's things in that are sort of been on the radical edge of drug pricing, even back into the AIDS epidemic days, that are going to need to come on. We're going to have to sort of enter that. We have to enlarge the sort of range of possibilities that we can do. I mean, because I think about this in terms of, I do a lot of sort of work with people who do cost effectiveness. We will pay for anything. Most other Western democracies say there's a cost and there's effectiveness, and you pay for things that work. And when you have choices, you pay for you maximize your cost effectiveness and don't sort of give everything away just because people want it. So we're going to have to put some rationality into place, which is common in other places around the world, and even consider some of the, the more radical proposals, like around the HCV drug pricing crisis in prisons. There was a question about should we invoke the ability for the government to take the patent, pay the company royalties, and manufacture generically? Yes, if you could do it, it'd be great. It's not going to happen anytime soon, but like we need to start thinking about that. All HCV, the PrEP drug that Gilead has, and which can prevent HIV infection, the government had a huge hand in developing it for those purposes. And they're basically now they're paying Gilead to give away the drug that they gave to them as a donation. I'm like, there's something very, very wrong here. So I think something's got to give. I'm part of a lawsuit against Gilead for antitrust violations in terms of very sort of probably illegal arrangements with partners in the pharmaceutical space. Sort of curtail sort of other people making generic versions of co-formulated drugs. We got to tackle them head on. They are really powerful. They have lots of money. All the age groups, are mad at the people who are doing Gilead. But the point is like, people's lives depend on their access to these medicines. And if they're at $84,000 a year, or even half that, it's not going to be helpful for people who are underinsured or who don't have insurance. Wendy?
Thank you. This is just wonderful. And it raises so many issues for me. And I want to ask you if you could just spend another minute or two talking about where you started, title. And I assume you meant to evoke one conception of citizenship, activism, engagement. But obviously citizen has a different term, not simply the voting, but the exclusionary term related to the rise of nationalism that we see around the world. And that seems to me to correlate in some way with, with everything actually that you've talked about, and we could start talking about it from slightly, but we could go back earlier, right? Which is how illness can both be a source of mobilization and a prompt for engagement and change, but then, right, Ebola and HIV, AIDS, and we can go on, it's also often a source of divisiveness and a way that, a different form of tribalism and stigmatization and putting people in camps. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about that and why you selectively become a citizen, which is so vital and so fraught in this moment.
So one is, I think it's a bit of an anachronism now. When Ancient America was written, it was about gay people becoming full citizens and getting their rights. In the age of Donald Trump, or even before that, it has all these other meanings. I mean, we don't have to go through the sort of catalog of horrors we've seen about what's happened to immigrants and refugees. The idea was that, I don't know, I can't channel Tony Kushner, but like if I could, I think he would say like citizenship is meant in sort of like the sense that we are all part of the polis, we're all part of the cities, the towns, the states we live in, and that exclusions based on sexuality, on gender, on race, on national origin are probably archaic. But I do think like he had a very specific idea about gay people and their role in American citizenship, which doesn't play well, I think, in 2019. Yeah.
Well, you talk and your work, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you focused on the epidemic of the 1990s, and I was thinking that you could draw some parallels and distinctions to an epidemic, in quotes, of drug overdose, and you mentioned that a little bit. There's been some discussion and conversation about how we're not seeing the same kind of activism and response from those who are affected by the overdose crisis, but as you can see And related to that, the reason why I use scare quotes is that the word epidemic arguably is used for a lot of things like vaping and social media and other things. And so what are the benefits and drawbacks of framing social problems in that way?
So one is like the organizational task around like why aren't people marching for changes in drug laws and all this stuff. I would love to talk to sociologists, but my own thing is like I feel like ACT UP and the AIDS epidemic, although it targeted sort of disenfranchised and the powerless in the U.S., it also went after middle-class gay men who had high-power jobs in New York. I mean, Larry Kramer was not a forgotten man, right? So I think what happened is that you saw a lot of sort of ability to mobilize resources, financial and otherwise, in the early days of the epidemic, which made sort of ACT UP, the gay men's health crisis. Gay men's health crisis and ACT UP, were gay middle-class white men, particularly in the beginning, even if it became more diverse over time. And so I think and also Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa, you have Zaki and Edwin and people who've been to the LGBT movement were already sort of NGO lawyers or activists who had a long history. So it wasn't coming out of sort of grassroots pressure. The question is, can there be better drug user organizing? There was actually a demonstration in Stanford by Nan Golden and some other people a couple of weeks ago. The picture showed up on the front of the New York Times, but no description of what they had done. But I think people are starting to organize around it. It's hard. It's really hard to organize. I don't know. And the epidemic framing is just not. It's just overused. There's always, epidemics are of a certain characteristic. I mean, vaping is not an epidemic. I mean, I don't, social media. I mean, I don't even know it. It's becoming generalized in a way to make it slightly meaningless. And from somebody who does disease stuff, just sort of keep it in the health realm. Other questions, students?
And please join me again in